Hey, welcome to the GFCN online community where we're taking a little bit of the online world and reserving it as a place for you to connect to God and connect to your neighbor. You're watching the 5th episode of our happiness series where we're looking at how to use the practice of forgiveness to increase our joy. We invite you to journey along with us by joining us in person, by liking, subscribing, and following our social channels, by volunteering, or by making a donation. If you join us, you can listen along, accept our challenges, and start to find more joy in your life. For the last few weeks, we've been looking at different ways to intervene in our time of unhappiness to increase our joy. We've highlighted the value of changing perspective, practicing humility, making time to laugh more, and accepting our situation. To start today's session, ask yourself what brings you joy and what limits your joy. One thing that can limit our joy might be feelings of resentment and revenge. That was the case for me throughout most of my life. Like so many others, my family didn't always get along, and I struggled with anger and resentment towards people I was supposed to love. That was hard for me, and I'd like to tell you a little bit more about my story. Some of my earliest memories as a child are of domestic violence and abuse. Because of my father's own hurts and problems, he had become addicted to alcohol and other substances. That was bad enough for his own health, but unfortunately he was often violent when drunk or strung out. And after one particularly violent episode, after more bruises, shouting, blue lights, and cop cars, after a court hearing and restraining order and divorce papers, my parents separated. Looking back, I think that this separation was the healthiest thing that happened to us, but at the time I really couldn't see it. I slowly became resentful and angry at my own father and at myself for being so weak. My resentment and my eventual desire for revenge was complicated because I also desperately wanted to be loved. And while my parents' separation was healthy for me in the long run, it didn't help my father. He began to show up in public places and make threats against us. He'd show up at our home in the middle of the night with a firearm. And this behavior went on for a couple of years until it would seem that my dad would start to get better. And I would visit once or twice, but then he would be back in jail or high and causing disturbance. It was an ugly cycle of disappointment and resentment. And as the years went by and I started entering into my teenage years, I began to hate my father more and more. Finally, one day, just before the Thanksgiving holiday, he called me. He said he was sorry for the pain he had caused and that he was getting better. He had his own place now, and he wanted to invite me and my siblings to join him for Thanksgiving. I was so angry and frustrated and wanted to get back at him for all the times that he had disappointed me. So I said, "No, I don't want to see you." And then I hung up. I hated him. I wanted to get back at him. Within the next week, he was dead, killed in an argument over drugs. Now I was stuck with my feelings. I hated him, but I also loved him. And now I was ashamed. I spiraled. I became desperately unhappy and began to struggle with depression and darker thoughts. One of the things that intervened in my unhappiness in that season, my depression and resentment, was a season of forgiveness. I want to tell you today that forgiveness can be one of the best ways to bring a step of joy back into your life. We all have baggage, hurts, pains, people, and things that we struggle to forgive. You may not be ready to go down the path of forgiveness, but if you are, then I'd like to share some of the things that I've learned about forgiveness in my own journey. Forgiveness is central to the Christian message and practice. In Christianity, we have a creed that we believe in. We say we believe in the forgiveness of sins, and some churches recite this every week. And those who do recite it, they announce to the world that they believe in forgiveness. Forgiveness is fundamental to the Christian understanding of baptism, communion, worship, and it shapes our thoughts about life after death. Even though forgiveness is central to the Christian message and Christian practice, forgiveness is celebrated around the world by people, non-Christian and Christian alike. In a comparative study on revenge and forgiveness, Michael McCullough found that 93% of 60 different cultures studied display forms of forgiveness and reconciliation. Acts of forgiveness are even found among many animals, except apparently for domestic cats. In his publication on forgiveness among the world's religions, Mark Rye asks major faith leaders to write about forgiveness from their faith. The article included Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism. Forgiveness expert Everett Worthington summarized this article saying that even though each different religion valued forgiveness, the concept was peripheral for most religions, but for Christianity, it was central. Forgiveness is almost always a choice, but sometimes it is a choice that happens slowly over a long period of time. A decision to forgive is primarily a decision to try to act differently toward the offender and not seeking payback, treating the person as valuable and valued person. The practice of forgiveness is repeated throughout Jesus' ministry. As our Lord Jesus is upon the cross, instead of seeking revenge, he forgives his betrayers, saying in Luke 23:34, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And in an earlier setting, Peter, a disciple of Jesus, comes and asks how many times he should forgive. Would 7 times be enough? And Jesus replies, "Not even 7 times, but I tell you 77 times." Which is another way of saying, don't keep count, silly. Just keep on forgiving. And that was in Matthew 18:21-22. And still another situation, Jesus is teaching the disciples and those near him on how to pray when he says, "Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your own trespasses." That's from Mark 11:25, which is very similar to that prayer that Jesus taught us to pray that we call the Our Father. As I began to learn about forgiving my father and myself, I learned it through a Christian lens and in a church setting. I learned through Christ's example about being able to choose an alternative to revenge. And I learned that I too could be forgiven. I chose to forgive to stop a cycle of revenge that had begun long before I was involved. There are a lot of reasons why someone might want to forgive someone else for something, or why they might want forgiveness. But I'd love to speak from my own experience. Early in his life, my father had been emotionally hurt, and he never really got over it. And apparently his resentment festered. In a way, he carried that resentment into his marriage and our family. And it continued along in a horrible cycle, so that one day I resented him for hurting me. A few years after his death, I chose to forgive him. And I chose to forgive myself because I didn't want to keep passing on my hurt to others. I didn't want to carry that baggage into the family that I would have someday. In a branch of study called family systems theory, there's a tool called the Genogram. It's kind of like a family tree, except instead of mapping just genealogy, it also maps out types of relationships that family members have towards each other. The Genogram kind of also maps out diseases and education and any other thing that might matter to a family and repeated patterns of those things. And what I learned studying the Genogram and family systems theory is that our family patterns do repeat. The Bible tells the story. Cain and Abel fight. Eventually that relationship passed on to Jacob and Esau. Then later, Joseph and his brothers. A repeated cycle of turning against your own family. But if there is a cycle of revenge, there's also a cycle of forgiveness. In their book with Douglas Abrams, Desmond Tutu and his daughter, Moat Tutu, describe the process of Christian forgiveness in just 4 steps. First, you must tell your story of what happened. Then, you name the hurt, and if you're able to choose forgiveness, you grant it, or you continue retelling your story. Finally, you either renew or you release that relationship. And there are 2 other step-by-step processes of forgiveness that I think are worth highlighting. Robert Enright's model and Everett Worthington's approach All three of these approaches highlight one aspect that was important for me in my journey of forgiveness, which was telling my story. Much later, after my childhood, after college, I went to counseling, and we talked about my story. And she asked me, how is it that you're here, healthy, and where you are today? I told her that my healing came through telling my story over and over in safe places, with friends, then in youth group, then with family, and all over again, and eventually with counseling. Before long, I had found that in telling my story and naming my hurt, I was able to choose something different besides revenge. And finally, I was able to see my dad not as a drug addict, but as a human being who suffered and struggled with things beyond his control. I began to see him as a human being, and I was able to release the pain. Every now and then, those feelings resurface, but I don't beat myself up over it. Forgiveness is ongoing. Even though I chose to forgive my father while a teenager, eventually I wanted to forgive myself for the way that I contributed to our relationship. My father was dead, so I couldn't ask him for forgiveness, but I did find it in God's embrace. In his book, The Weight of Glory, C.S. Lewis argues that forgiveness is an ongoing back and forth of seeking forgiveness and of offering forgiveness. When you think about your own joy, happiness, and your own spiritual life, you may face things about others and about yourself that you struggle to forgive. No one can force you to forgive. You have to choose it for yourself and others involved. It doesn't mean that you're weak or that justice can't happen. Forgiveness is disrupting that cycle of resentment and revenge that gets in the way of your own happiness and your own health. If you think you might be ready to practice forgiveness, I want to invite you to join me in Desmond Tutu's Global Forgiveness Challenge. There are 4 steps. Step 1, tell your story. If you're trying to tell your story but you want to avoid re-traumatizing yourself, you might imagine watching your life as if in a movie. Or you could write down your story. Instead of using the word I, use your name. So using third person instead of first person. And then step 2, after you tell your story, name the hurt. If you're trying to name the hurt for the first time, you might continue watching yourself as if in a movie. Try to understand the feelings of the hurt person. Why did they have those feelings? What were the causes of the feelings? Step 3, grant forgiveness. This means accepting the imperfect humanity of the person who hurt you, and it means accepting your own imperfect human nature. Step 4, renew or release the relationship. After you've chosen to forgive, there's still this important decision. Will the relationship keep going, or do you need to let it go? Renewing the relationship offers healing for yourself and for your community. Releasing it lets you move on, especially if you can truly wish the best for the person who has harmed you. I'd love to see you enjoy that joy which comes from forgiveness and our other happiness interventions. I hope you'll accept this challenge. For now, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and may the Lord's face shine upon you all the days of your life. Peace be the journey.